So, in this lecture, we're going to talk about social influence or the role that other people have on influencing our own behaviors. Let's start by talking about conformity, which is the tendency of people to alter their behavior as a result of group pressure. I'm sure we're all familiar with the high school woes of peer pressure, but conformity happens across the lifespan as well. Ever go along with a group that you just didn't want to? Conformity is an essential social mechanism, and without it, we wouldn't have social norms and acceptable behavior. The desire to be viewed favorably and to be accepted by others is strong in social animals, including people. Therefore, conformity often requires no overt pressure. Most people naturally adopt their behaviors, beliefs, and appearances that are similar to those of their peer group. However, pressure to conform can be subtle or overt and might also be exerted by practices such as ostracizing people who don't conform or mocking people with different values. So, examples of conformity in everyday society involve driving on the left side of the road or the right side, depending on the country, greeting other people with hello or hi, how are you when we see them, forming lines at bus stops, and eating our food with a knife and fork instead of our hands. Mask wearing behavior in public has become another example of conformity during the pandemic. Some degree of conformity is necessary in order for us to fit into social groups. So, for example, in many cultures, wearing clothes in public is just expected behavior. Not conforming to this social norm would result in confusion, gawking, possible concern for one's mental state, and perhaps a citation for indecent exposure. Those who conform to social norms are seen as normal and are typically not ostracized. However, this can all become problematic when the cultural expectation might be harmful, or when certain people don't want to conform but do so in order to avoid the consequences of pushing back. Teenagers, for example, often feel pressured to engage in behaviors like risky sex or alcohol consumption, even if they don't want to, because their friends are doing it and they are concerned that if they don't, they're going to be rejected from the group. Now, this doesn't mean that people can't also behave independently. And independent behavior that does not conform to established social norms is an essential mechanism for social change. Examples of failure to conform, which have led to social change, include the suffragette movement, civil rights activists in countries with oppressive regimes, and fashion trendsetters. These are all examples in which people pushed back and said, I don't think that what's going on makes sense. I'm going to do the opposite, even if I'm in the minority. Conformity was classically demonstrated in Solemn Ash's studies in the 1950s. And so that's what I want to talk about next. In Ash's study, participants would be seated in a room with a group of other people. So the image on your slide here shows an actual group from Ash's study. So the man in the middle is actually the participant. The two on his either side of him are Confederates, which, if you remember, those are actors. They're hired by the experimenter to respond in certain ways. So the whole group is shown the image that you see on the top of your slide. So they are shown the standard line first, and then the three comparison lines. And they're asked to identify which of the comparison lines is the same height as the standard line. What's the answer? It's pretty clear that it's line number 2, right? We can see that pretty easily. Shouldn't be a problem. Everyone in the room should say number 2. But what happens if everyone else in the room says the answer was line 3? Would you go along with them, or would you hold out and say, no, I know it's number 2, you're ridiculous? So let's take a look at what happened in the study.
As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are Confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3.
3.
3.
3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2. 2.
2.
2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. 1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2.
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the third position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1.
2.
1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with a group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
So Ash found that the majority of the participants conformed to the obviously incorrect norm on at least one of the 12 trials. So in the picture, and this is the same picture we saw a minute ago, you see that the participant in the middle is struggling. Look at him. He looks confused. He's like really thinking about it because the two on either side of him gave the wrong answer. And this participant was actually one of the few who stuck to his guns and gave the correct answer in all 12 trials, even in the face of the pressure to conform. So at the conclusion of this experiment, participants were asked why they'd gone along with the group. In most cases, the students stated that while they knew the group was wrong, they didn't want to risk facing ridicule. We've all been in that situation, right? Where you know that what's going on in the group isn't the right thing to do, and yet we don't want to be the one who stands against everybody. A few participants suggested that they actually believed the other members of the group were correct in their answers, which shows the power that groupthink can have over us, and we'll talk about groupthink in a little bit. These results suggest that conformity can be influenced both by a need to fit in and a belief that other people are smarter or better informed. Well, if everyone else is saying this, they must be smarter than me. I'm the only one that I can't be right. Given the level of conformity seen in Ash's experiments, conformity can be even stronger in real-life situations where stimuli are more ambiguous or more difficult to judge. But some people stick to their guns and refuse to conform, even in the face of all of that really powerful social pressure. Well, what makes some people able to resist? The video mentioned a few. Ash went on to conduct further experiments to see what factors influenced how and when people conform. And so he found a couple things. First, that conformity increases when more people are present. So the more people in the room, the more likely you are to conform, but this is only true to a point. Once the group size goes beyond 4 or 5 people, we don't really see much difference in conformity anymore. Conformity also increases when the task becomes more difficult. So in the face of uncertainty or ambiguity, people turn to others for information about how to respond. Ash's line task was pretty easy. We could all figure out the correct answer, pretty quickly just from looking at it. But if the task were really challenging, like if I asked you to calculate a difficult multiplication problem in your head, you might be more likely to go with the group since you're less certain of your own ability to get the correct answer. Conformity increases when other members of the group are a higher social status. So when people view the others in the group as more powerful, influential, or knowledgeable than themselves, they're much more likely to go along with the group. A great example of this is peer pressure among adolescents. Think about the less popular kids who might be more inclined to drink when the more popular kids are doing it too. Conformity tends to decrease, however, when people are able to respond privately. Like we saw in the video, when the guy was able to write down his response, he was much more free to be honest and go against the group. And this makes sense. If no one knows what our response is, we can feel more free to say what we truly think. Research has also shown that conformity decreases if they have support from at least one other individual in the group. So do you remember the later trial where they gave the participant a partner who also said the correct answer, even though all the other Confederates still said the wrong answer? Because you now have a partner who is also saying the correct answer, you're like, okay, I'm definitely not crazy. And this strengthens your resolve and lets you feel more free to give the correct answer, demonstrating how support can help to decrease conformity. Now, not everyone engages in conformity in the same way. So even in cases where the pressure to conform is strong and a large percentage of individuals do conform, such as in Ash's line judging research, not everyone does so. There's usually some people who are willing and able to push against the prevailing norm. So in Ash's study, for example, despite the strong pressures, 24% of the participants never conformed on any trials. We focus to this point on the situational determinants of conformity, such as the number of people in the room and their unanimity. We have not yet considered the question of which people are likely to conform and which people are not, so individual differences. People prefer to have an optimal balance between being similar to and different from others. When we're made to feel too similar to others, we tend to express our individuality. But when we're made to feel too different from others, we attempt to increase our acceptance. Supporting this idea, research has found that people who have lower self-esteem are more likely to conform in comparison with those who have higher self-esteem. Excuse me. This makes sense because self-esteem rises when we know we're being accepted by others, and people with lower self-esteem have a greater need to belong. And people who are dependent on or have a strong need for approval from others are also much more conforming. Age matters. Individuals who are either younger or older tend to be more easily influenced compared to individuals in their 40s and 50s. People who highly identify with the group that's creating the conformity are also much more likely to conform to group norms in comparison to people who really don't care very much. So the teenager who really cares strongly about fitting in, or perhaps has very high social goals or popularity goals of making friends and being part of the higher social status group, they're going to be more likely to go along with the peer pressure compared to the adolescent who just really doesn't care if they fit in or not. Some small gender differences have also been found. So men on average are more concerned about appearing to have high status and may be able to demonstrate this status by acting independently from the opinions of others. So in other words, men tend to be a little bit more likely to go against conformity or to not conform. On the other hand, although there are substantial individual differences among them, women tend to be more concerned with connecting to others and maintaining group harmony. So what this means is that, at least while being observed by others, men are more likely to hold their ground, act independently, and can refuse to conform, while women are more likely to conform to the opinions of others to prevent social disagreement and maintain social harmony. But this is only the case when they're being observed. These differences are much less apparent when conformity occurs in private, so like if they were able to write down their answers. In addition to the public versus private nature of the situation, the topic being discussed also matters, with both men and women being less likely to conform on topics that they know a lot about, in comparison with topics which they feel less knowledgeable. So for example, to take a largely overgeneralized example, when the topic is sports, women tend to conform to men, whereas the opposite is true when the topic is fashion. Thus, it appears that the small observed differences between men and women in conformity may be due, at least in part, to informational influence. And in terms of culture difference, conformity to social norms is more apparent in Eastern collectivist cultures than Western independent cultures, which makes sense because in a collectivist culture, you tend to be more concerned with what other people think, their thoughts and their feelings, whereas in Western cultures, independence is much more encouraged. One process that can make us more vulnerable to conformity is de-individuation, which is the tendency of people to engage in uncharacteristic behavior when they're stripped of their usual identities. De-individuation theory was developed to explain the violence and irrationality of crowds. So how does a group of seemingly normal individuals become an unruly mob? According to de-individuation theory, the anonymity and excitement of the crowd make individuals lose a sense of their individual identity. So as a result, they cease to evaluate themselves as individuals and become irrational and irresponsible. This can make a crowd fickle, explosive, and prone to anti-normative and disinhibited behavior. Wearing masks, and by this I mean masks that cover your whole face, not coronavirus masks, like Halloween masks or Mardi Gras masks, that overall conceal your identity. Wearing masks can increase de-individuation because people don't know who you are, creating a greater vulnerability to social influence. So ever seen crowd riots where people have their faces covered? Hiding your face or creating this sense of anonymity may play a role in conformity. Another interesting and related concept is that of a backspace. So this is an environment in which you're anonymous because you don't know the other people there. Robin Milhausen first studied this idea by looking at people's behaviors during Mardi Gras. So people who normally behave pretty respectfully might go hog wild during Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Drinking a lot, maybe pulling up their shirt for beads, behaviors that they would never engage in their normal circumstances. This idea has since been expanded to apply to vacation in general, studying abroad while in college, and even the first semester away at college. So in other words, this sense of de-individuation or freedom may result in us behaving totally differently than we would if we were around people that we knew. The Stanford Prison Study is probably one of the most famous examples of the negative effects of de-individuation. So the gist is that Philip Zimbardo recruited a group of young men for a 2-week, quote, psychological study of prison life, and randomly assigned them to either be a prisoner or a guard. This was an extremely immersive experience, so the participants were expected to literally live in the study for 2 weeks. The guards were given actual prison guard uniforms. They wore sunglasses, contributing to their sense of de-individuation. But what happened was that things got out of control really quickly. So let's take a look.
In 1971, in the basement of the psychology department of Stanford University, a mock prison was created. It rivaled all social psychology experiments in controversy.
Shortly after I finished this Stanford Prison study, Milgram embraced me and said, "I'm so happy that you did this." He said, because now you can take off some of the heat that he's had to bear alone of having done the most unethical study.
Although this experiment is over 30 years old, its enduring power has been underscored by the events at Abu Ghraib.
When we got to Abu Ghraib, it was eerie.
were being told to rough up Iraqis that wouldn't cooperate. I mean, they're torturing, they're abusing detainees. You're looking at the situation thinking, they've condoned this, but why? And if it wouldn't have been for those photos, no one would have ever believed what was going on over there.
When I first saw the pictures, immediately a sense of familiarity struck me because I knew that I had been there before. I'd been in this type of situation. I knew what was going on in my mind. The photographs were strikingly familiar to the photographs that we had taken, many of the photographs I had taken in the prison study. We didn't do any of the stuff that you see in Abu Ghraib where they, get into a big pile or something like that. But I certainly subjected them to all kinds of humiliations. I don't know where I would have stopped myself. Given enough time, we could have got there.
When the images of the abuse and torture in Abu Ghraib were revealed, immediately the military went on the defensive, saying, it's a few bad apples. When we see somebody doing bad things, we assume they're bad people to begin with. But what we know in our study is there are a set of social psychological variables that can make ordinary people do things they never could imagine doing.
At Abu Ghraib, ordinary people perpetrated extraordinary abuses. To understand why, it helps to reach back to the lessons of Zimbardo's experiment, how people respond to a cruel environment without clear rules.
I think he and everybody else who came down into that situation got caught up into that situation. And the sense that this was an experiment, that began to fade away. It became just life.
We frankly didn't anticipate what was going to happen. We tried to really test the power of the environment to change and transform otherwise normal people, much as Milgram had changed or transformed otherwise normal people in an obedience situation. We wanted to do it in a prison-like situation.
Over 70 men volunteered for Zimbardo's experiment.
And they completed a battery of psychological tests. We picked 24 who were the most normal, most healthy. Half are going to be guards, half are going to be prisoners. And it's like flipping a coin, and heads, this one's a guard, this one's a prisoner. So at the beginning, there's no difference in the kinds of people who are in your two groups.
He's describing a random assignment protocol. That's why we do random assignment, to make sure that the two groups are as equal as we can possibly get them.
When we were given our jobs as guards, we were issued a uniform, which was a plain sort of khaki or lighter colored uniform.
And then we gave them the symbols of power, handcuffs, a whistle, a big billy club. And then the other thing we gave them were silver reflecting sunglasses.
When you have mirror sunglasses on, then nobody can see your eyeballs. I think that anytime you put on what essentially is a mask, and you mask your identity, then it allows you to behave in ways that you would not behave if you didn't have the mask on.
De-individuation.
More realistic. I had arranged with this Palo Alto Police Department to make mock arrests.
When I was arrested, it was a surprise to me. I didn't think I was going to be brought to an actual police station. I didn't think I was going to go through a booking process.
The guards then put a blindfold on them, stripped them naked, and then they put them in dresses, smocks with no underpants. Each had a number that replaced their name. They had to know the number. They could only be referred to by that number. And they had a chain on one foot, which was put there to remind them at all times of their loss of freedom. So all of these things produces a sense of being dehumanized. On the first day, I said, this is not going to work. And the guards felt awkward giving orders. And they'd say, okay, line up, repeat your numbers. And the prisoners start giggling. And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoner's named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy, he begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the worst, most intimidating, cruel prison guard that I could possibly be. was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act. And I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop. We did have to do things like push-ups. We would have to sing things. At the beginning, we protested some of the actions. We did things to irritate the guards.
So the guards' authority was challenged right off the bat. And the guards had to decide how they were going to handle that. And they had to decide it without our input. I mean, again, this was not a Milgram study in which we were standing over them telling them what to do. And they began to see the prisoners' behavior as kind of an affront to their authority. And they began to push back.
We would ramp up the general harassment, just sort of crank it up a bit. Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. You know, he's the prison warden. He's not stopping me.
There was the first evening a kind of rebellion that took place.
The prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells and said, we refuse to come out. They took off their numbers. They didn't want to be de-individuated. They started cursing the guards to their face. And the key turning point was the guards began to think of them as dangerous prisoners. And so the guards formulated a plan, used fire extinguishers, took the doors down, dragged the prisoners out, stripped them naked, and essentially broke the rebellion in a purely physical way.
From that point on, the study was as remarkable a series of events as I've ever seen. It was a real laboratory for Zimbardo and I to watch human nature transformed in a very rapid way in the face of a very powerful situation.
People really suffered. I mean, guards did terrible things to the prisoners. They punished them by putting them in solitary confinement, which was a small closet. You could squat or stand, but you couldn't sit, and it was dark and dank, actually.
Every hour, every day, there's a teeny little bit more of an increment. And they're stepping up, taunting the prisoners. They're stepping up. The count's not letting them sleep. They're stepping up. I don't think from 1 minute to the next, the people who are in it see the change and see the difference.
Okay, I think you get the idea. You can watch the rest of the video on your own if you're interested. But what happened was that things got out of control really quickly. The guards were starting to treat the prisoners cruelly, to dole out harsher and harsher punishments. And as they mentioned, the guards were not instructed to act this way as part of the study. They were really left on their own. It was sort of a social experiment to see what would happen. And so at first, the prisoners started to rebel, leading to the guards becoming more sadistic. The study was supposed to run for 2 weeks and ended up being shut down after only 6 days because the prisoners were starting to have nervous breakdowns. Now, this study would never get IRB approval today, but it's an interesting and somewhat horrific example of de-individuation and is a really well-cited and frequently discussed study in the field of psychology because it's such a clear example of what happens when people are given power, but also the ability to hide behind a uniform and mirrored sunglasses. Part of the reason why groups and crowds can get out of control really quickly is something called groupthink, which is an emphasis that groups can play on unanimity at the expense of critical thinking and sound decision-making. So we talked about conformity, and when faced with lots of people saying one thing, the less likely we're going to want to be the ones to hold out against the group. We don't want to be the only one pushing back because then we run the risk of them turning against us. Remember how I said earlier that humans are profoundly social creatures who don't like rejection. That's just not a risk we're willing to take. And groupthink really does happen in the real world. Take a second and think back to a time in your life when maybe you made a groupthink decision that ended up being a bad choice. Maybe when you were in high school, you packed too many people into a car and didn't wear seatbelts. Figured, we all have to get there. There's 8 of us. It's fine. We'll make it work. Great idea until you got pulled over. Or on a larger scale, you could think about the Bay of Pigs and the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, where intelligent people went against their own instincts to adhere to the will of a group. There are some symptoms that make people more vulnerable to groupthink. So, for example, one is the illusion of the group's invulnerability. We can't possibly fail because we're in this together. You tend to feel more powerful and invincible and protected in a group, even though that's not the case. Or there's the illusion of a group's unanimity. So people might say things like, well, obviously we all agree, even though a few people don't, but they're just being quiet about it. So by now we probably agree that groupthink can get out of control very quickly and has the potential to really be quite dangerous. So let's talk about some ways to avoid groupthink. First, we can encourage dissent. One way to do this is by appointing a devil's advocate, whose job is to say, well, it seems like we're all mostly on the same page here, but let's take a minute to consider some opposing point of views. Another strategy is to select someone who is outside of the group, who will feel less compelled or pressured to agree. So if you bring in another person who wasn't part of the initial conversation, they may not feel the same peer pressure to give in. You can also hold follow-up meetings to allow time for ideas to simmer and allow time for people to reflect on ideas and consider alternatives rather than trying to make a quick decision. On the other side of groupthink are group polarization issues. This is the tendency of group discussions to strengthen the dominant position held by the individual group members. This can be helpful if it leads to more efficient decisions, but can be really destructive if it results in views becoming more extreme. Consider a scenario where white supremacists band together and all feed off of each other's views, sort of egging each other on. Not ideal. Another example that shows the dangerous effects of groupthink are cults, which are groups that exhibit intense and unquestioning devotion to a single cause. In 1975, Marshall Applewhite founded the cult known as Heaven's Gate and convinced members that he was a reincarnated version of Jesus Christ who would take them to a starship in the afterlife. When a major comet approached Earth, the members of Heaven's Gate believed it was their calling and performed a group suicide where 39 people drank a poisoned cocktail. Not much is known about cults, but we do know that they promote groupthink in 4 major ways. First, through a persuasive leader who fosters loyalty. Second, by disconnecting members from the outside world. They often take away access to phones and internet and make members cut tie with their family and friends so that they're not able to receive that sort of external perspective. They discourage questioning of assumptions, and they gradually indoctrinate members. So it's a slow process in which the person becomes used to the intense beliefs of the cult very slowly over time. So we see a lot about cults in popular media, but I don't know how well those actually hold up against what cults really look like. We really just scientifically don't know a ton about them. Obedience is adherence to orders from those of higher authority. It's often an essential ingredient in our daily lives in terms of following rules to keep ourselves and others safe. So we stop at stoplights, we follow parking signs, we obey police officers if they ask us to do something. But these all stem from the idea that the authority figure is right and good. As we saw with cults and conformity, when we begin to follow others blindly and stop asking questions about why they're asking us to behave in certain ways, it can be a problem. So we see this on a small scale in daily life situations, such as if a school bully persuades classmates to be mean to a certain student. But it can also happen on a larger, more horrific scale as well. So for example, the Holocaust, where an entire army blindly followed Hitler's lead. One of the most prominent researchers on obedience was Stanley Milgram, who was actually a student of Solomon Asch's. So we talked about Milgram in the beginning of the semester. Milgram was interested in the idea of when good people go bad. And so he gave he did the shock studies where a participant was asked to shock another participant, although we know that it was all contrived and nobody was actually being injured. Milgram was interested in why the Holocaust occurred. How could people have been so obedient and commit these horrific acts that they had to know were wrong? So he designed an experiment to test the influence of obedience and authority on normal people. Some of the takeaways from Milgram's work are that there are individual differences associated with obedience and compliance. So the level of moral development was negatively correlated with compliance. In other words, the higher someone's moral development, the more morally developed they were, the less likely they were to be compliant in the face of pressure to obey an authority figure telling them something that they didn't agree with. Those with the high authoritarianism or rigidness and strictness to follow authority were also more likely to comply. So, not surprisingly, someone who favors strict obedience to authority of the government at the expense of personal freedom would be more likely to comply. There were no consistent sex or cultural differences found to be associated with levels of obedience. So the takeaway message is that the power of the authority figure is very, very strong for us social creatures and can be both very positive and effective. But destructive obedience on a large scale probably requires both an authority figure and a core group of people. So we have to be cognizant of what we're being asked to do and always question the things that just don't quite seem right to us. In the next section, we're going to talk about how our behaviors influence others, and this could be in positive ways, such as pro-social helping behaviors, but also in aggressive ways, such as harming behaviors. So that will be coming up next.